who had been living with the family since his birth. Into the cart went a few belongings, the women's jewelry, and the few heirlooms they had thought to snatch hurriedly on their way out. Joseph took one last look around, then ordered the driver to go as quickly as possible to the wind house. Every plantation in Martinique had a wind house, an all but impregnable structure with stone walls 6 feet thick and no windows, built deep into the hillside where no storm, no matter how fierce, could penetrate. Massive wooden doors made from hardwood cut in the rainforest higher up on the slopes opened into a dark, cavernous room that could hold several dozen people and supplies of food and water. In this refuge, secure behind the stout wooden doors, they would wait out the storm. In the high wooden tower at the edge of the cane fields, the bell began to ring, sounding the alarm. Work ceased, and the field hands rushed at once to their huts, gathered their children and a few provisions, and made their way to the sugar mill. The other buildings on the plantation were dilapidated and neglected, but the stone-walled sugar mill, built several generations earlier in more prosperous times, was still sturdy. It would stand up to the Ualu. More cartloads were sent to the wind house, full of candles and lanterns, baskets of salted fish and cassavas, and loaves made from manioc flour, large red earthenware vessels full of fresh water and molasses beer. The midwives brought their knives and cords and charms made of dried palm leaves, blessed by the healers to ward off zombies. By early evening the plantation was in total darkness, and the rain was falling in sheets, swelling the streams and flooding the fields. Hour by hour the wind grew in force and violence, churning the bay into high waves and surging breakers. In the shelter where the Tacher family and their house slaves were waiting out the storm, the thick wooden doors began to bulge outward and tug against the ropes that restrained them. Joseph and the other men took turns pulling on the ropes with all their force, fighting the terrible outward sucking of the wind. So loud was its roaring that they could barely distinguish the sounds of destruction outside, the crashing of the huge trees as they fell to earth, the flying apart of the 2-story plantation house, the mowing down of the cane fields and the plantation gardens. The wind had become a great scythe, sweeping across the land, cutting down everything in its path, while rain lashed at the devastated earth and washed the debris into the swollen rivers. Joseph, nearly at the end of his strength, listened to the thunderous noise of the wind and despaired. Everything he owned was being carried off, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. He had no money, he was deeply in debt, and his health had been poor ever since the previous year when he had nearly died of malignant fever. He was only 36, but felt much older, worn down by the weight of his failure and by the continuing nagging disappointment of his unhappy domestic life. He'd been struggling fitfully since his marriage 5 years earlier to make the plantation a success. Troisillet, its buildings, and its 150 African slaves had been a wedding present from Rose Claire's parents. Joseph had an obligation to make it profitable. But well-intentioned though he was ineffectual. He lacked the energy and capability to manage a large estate, neither manly nor masterful as his younger brother Robert was. Joseph could not seem to find the discipline or the skill to increase the plantation's output of sugar. He was reasonably intelligent, but pleasure-loving and easily distracted. He preferred spending time at Fort Royal to meeting with his overseer Black or listening to the complaints of his unhappy wife, whose task it was, in his absence, to run the plantation. Life was so much easier at Fort Royal, the chief town of the island and the center of its social life. There he could sleep until noon, meet with his friends in the evenings to dine and play cards, visit his beautiful mulatto mistresses, and pretend that he was a man of substance and breeding, instead of a near bankrupt and the son of a disreputable father. In recent years he had been spending less and less time at Troisillet, letting his responsibilities go. Times were hard, what with the British blockade making it all but impossible to sell what sugar the estate produced. It hardly seemed worthwhile to keep trying. And the longer Joseph stayed away, the more run down Troisillet became, the buildings falling into disrepair, the fields only partially cultivated, the slaves dwindling in numbers as their absent master failed to provide for them. Now, of course, none of that mattered. The hurricane was sweeping everything away.